I got a woo? Before I introduce Vishaan, I just want a couple of comments about today's events, and hopefully you're having as an enjoyable experience and an enlightening experience as I'm having. Sitting here in this building, I was lucky enough to work on this building, and Marianne Gilmartin mentioned it, starting design in 2001 and I think it opened in around 2007. And one of the things that, you talk about innovation, we sit here sometimes and we think about where the industry, the challenges, and this has been, I think, a day of talking about the challenges and what we have to do. But I look back at the innovations, how we would do this building today compared to the way that we would do it back in 2007, and we've made an incredible amount of progress. I'll give two examples. One right outside this window. The innovative challenge was to put a garden inside a tall tower, surrounded by tall towers, and whether it would work. And I remember the presentation by the landscape architect to show what they could actually do, and it started off with, "Have you thought about moss?" Because as you see, that was an innovation that was successful. One that was less successful, but has since changed, was the exterior columns of this building. If you go out and walk around, there's essentially 800 feet of exterior columns that are exposed, that were painfully and painstakingly detailed, only to be covered up with intumescent paint, because post 9/11, with all the challenges that were there, was not something we could get through the building department. I'm telling you that story because we just finished up working on the shed, and we had $6 million worth of intumescent paint, and we were able to use fire engineering today, which we could have used back then, but they weren't even open to it, to convince the building department and the fire department that we could expose that incredible steel and not spend $5 million that we didn't need to spend. So I think while we have a long way to go in our industry, I think it's really important to remember that we are making progress. Hopefully meetings like this and discussions like this, we're going to accelerate it. So with that said, I want to introduce Vishaan Chakrabarti. I've known Vishaan, I think, about 20 years now. He's got something in very high amounts that I think we all in this room have, and that's a love for cities, and in particular, a love for New York. So let me give you a little bit of his background that kind of represents that. He's the founder of Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, POW, a firm he founded in 2015, dedicated to the advancement of sustainable cities. POW's projects include designs for comprehensive new communities in East New York, Philadelphia, the Domino Sugar Refinery, Newark, Detroit, Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, as well as a master plan vision for Sunnyside Yards in Queens. POW's Penn Palimpsest project that imagined creating a light-filled public commons by recycling foundations and superstructure of the Madison Square Garden to renew Penn Station and its surrounds. I don't know if hopefully you saw that in what was in the New York Times. Really an exciting way of looking at re-envisioning the city. Vishaan teaches and designed an urban theory at Columbia University and is the author of A Country of Cities, a forceful polemic arguing for the critical importance of cities, public transportation, parks, affordable density, and the public investment to make an infrastructure of opportunity possible. Early in his career, where I first met Vishaan, he was the director of the Manhattan office of the New York City Department of Planning, where he played a major role in the post 9/11 planning of Lower Manhattan and other projects essential to New York's future, including the Hudson Yards. He was a founding member of the board of directors of Friends of the High Line and currently serves on the boards of the Regional Planning Association, Citizens Budgets Commission, and the Architectural League of New York. So as you can see, his background and what he continues to do is to really drive thoughts and real-world solutions to cities. I'm going to tell you what I also hope he's going to do someday is run for mayor, and when he does, I'm going to head up his campaign. So with that, I'd like to introduce Vishaan.
That's an introduction. Thank you, Tom. You know, when I started my firm almost 4 years ago, Tom was instrumental. He immediately called me and said, you know, what do you need? Do you need office space? Do you need IT? I mean, this is when you say I love New York, that's what New York is really about. So I really appreciate that. So it's an honor to be introduced by you. Thank you for having me today. I might end up being the guy that you wish you hadn't invited to the party, right? I might be that guy, because I was given this topic to talk about, faster, overcoming regulatory and procurement issues. I really actually have no idea how to build buildings faster. If you guys do, that's great. I actually don't know. I've done some work with modular and prefab, but it's not at all my specialty. The regulatory stuff but I'm not sure the service of understanding our regulatory world is about building things faster. So I'm gonna kind of retitle my own talk and say, rather than, I think you heard from Rit, was it, no, one was bolder and one was smarter, right? So smarter and bolder you heard today. I'm gonna go for better. And it's about building cities that people want. Because if you want to understand why there's a lot of regulation and maybe regulatory, what you consider to be regulatory overreach of our industry, you have to look in the mirror. Because, so, you know, let me explain what I mean by that, and I'm including myself in that mirror. Mies said that architecture is the will of the epoch translated into space. And what he meant by that was that architecture is actually both a mirror and a window into the challenges of our time. And when I look at the challenges of our time, I think about certainly climate change, social inequity, and what I like to call sort of technological dislocation. The fact that technology is great, but it's causing a lot of both, you know, economic and psychological dislocations in our world. If you have teenagers, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I would argue that the city is the platform where all of those three challenges are going to play themselves out for good or for bad. So a few years ago, Tom mentioned I wrote this book, and it was this argument that cities were the answer to a lot of these problems, that transit-oriented density was very important for the environment because the average city dweller, through no angelic act of their own, uses mass transit, lives in smaller units that heat and cool each other, and tends to use much more carbon as a consequence. And so rather than sort of retrofit the 20th century technology of the suburbs, that we could orient ourselves in the 21st century towards a much more rail-based lifestyle that would leave nature natural. So one of the big themes of the book is that if you love nature, don't live in it. But it wasn't just an environmental argument. It was also an economic argument that said, you know, actually we have data that shows as people are coming together in cities, if you understand why Google went from about 1 employee in 2000 to, in New York City to, I think the second largest employment center for Google is New York now. It's about this. It's about the fact that as young people come together in density, we know that that actually enhances levels of innovation, of serendipity, that cities are these engines for new ideas. Great. And so there are all sorts of examples of this. You could look at a place like London, fantastic, growing, all sorts of interesting energy. But you know, the thing is, we all, and Tom mentioned that I worked for Mike Bloomberg after 9/11, and you know, no one talked about gentrification back then, except for like really diehard housing advocates that understood this picture, that the country was losing its affordable housing stock, defined as, you know, basically housing that you could afford with a third of your income, precipitously since World War II. And that this situation is getting so bad that we get this. This is tied to that affordability issue because that tension of people not being able to afford their own lives is spilling out into every conversation we have, to the point where we're seeing complete misrepresentations. I mean, if you followed the Amazon story, you knew that there was no $3 billion that was going to go to the subways and schools. It was a tax abatement off of about $30 billion of taxes that Amazon was going to pay. But politicians saw no reason not to, you know, basically spin that story, right? And more regulations will come out of that. I tried, and many people tried, to write about why Amazon was a really good thing for the city of New York, but that's now a sort of foregone conclusion. But let's talk about what's happening in the regulatory world. I'm sure many of you saw this. And, you know, a lot of my colleagues in the building industry, I heard a lot of laughter in the industry about this, right? Because like any of us in the industry knows that you can build a glass building that's sustainable, right? So, isn't someone just making the wrong connection here that's saying, well, glass buildings are responsible for all these emissions? There is a city council member in Philadelphia right now proposing to ban all buildings with bay windows because a lot of the new development have these boxy bay windows. Now, you may read all of this and think it's like an Onion headline, right? Like, what's happening? But I think we mock these things at our peril. So why do I say this? So I've lived in Union Square most of my life, and I was walking up the street with a friend and said, Vishaan, he said, I know you like cities and density and all this stuff, but isn't this thing a big blue middle finger to the whole of downtown New York? We just ignore this stuff. It just goes up. Right? And if we build it smarter or bolder or faster, we think we've done our job. Or this beauty, which of course in Dallas, which is melting the Nasher. The architect also runs a piano of this building that we're standing in. Or you can go out to Long Island City and see this. Einstein famously said that if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, that's the definition of insanity. So we have to stop just patting ourselves on the back for building this. And just because it's legal to build this today doesn't mean it's going to be legal tomorrow, right? Because people hate it. And they don't just hate it here. This is Gurgaon, a city, I use that term in quotes, outside of New Delhi, India, where you're basically taking your own life in peril by crossing the street. This is in China. This is in Korea. This is what we're building. This is what we're leaving our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And this is where we go on vacation. And we think nothing about this disconnect, right? That, we go to the 5th and the 6th in Paris, we go to streets in Shanghai or Tokyo, in Fez, in Rio de Janeiro, Venice. Now, regulation has something to do with the situation as well. Actually, from a regulatory standpoint, Venice is illegal, right? It's also sinking, but it's illegal. Why is it illegal? Well, ADA, right? Both of my parents were in wheelchairs at the end of their lives. I'm not making fun of ADA, but I'm just saying, how do you build that bridge with ADA, right? And so, one of the things I've talked about is if we could get our technologists to invent something other than Instagram, like a wheelchair that was a much better piece of technology, that would be great. These things actually exist. Think about, in your industry, think about the billions upon billions of dollars that get spent on ADA. You could give everyone who needs a wheelchair that climbs stairs for far less money than what we spend on the madness of, ramps and extra elevators and all of that stuff. Or if you go out into the suburbs and you see the seas of asphalt that's built with any new suburban subdivision, that's about the turning radius of a fire ladder truck, right? And what's interesting is, again, with technology, we're using drones to fight fires in a different way. There's maybe all new ways to access the top of burning buildings other than those big fire ladder trucks. So technology may actually be part of the solution to why our cities have these seas of asphalt and don't have any of the charm of the cities that we built before the 20th century. But that's not enough of an answer. This is 6 cities built on 6 continents around the world. And to use a technical term, it's crap. Right? It's utter crap. Or you can look at why that actually comes to pass. And you can say, well, it's capitalism, right? That we've learned how to optimize the materials with which we build. Okay, well, what does optimize mean? I actually had a student this year who did this whole project, and he's a joint real estate and architecture student, and calculated the net present value of building budgets from pre-war buildings to today, and looked at things like labor cost, but also is just asking basic questions about why it is we can't build buildings of anywhere near the appeal or quality that we could, with all of the technology that we have over 100 years ago. I'm very interested in materiality as an architect, and even something as simple as brick. You think of brick as a relatively cheap material, and why is brick is one of these materials that it's actually still the scale of the human hand, right? And so there's this kind of natural relationship one has to it. So actually in a city not too far away, I was proposing a brick skyscraper, about 500 feet tall. Contractor said, we can't do it, we just can't afford it. Too heavy. And I left the meeting with one of my young architects, one of my team members, and he looked at me and said, Vishaan, there are 500-foot tall buildings that are brick in New York City that were built 100 years ago. And we can't do this? So you sit there, and we're sitting here with drawings about, brick as wallpaper, and pretending that those massive joints between that cast-in-place brick is somehow similar to hand-laid brick. Come on, guys. This can't be the way we operate in the world. Or take another classic. This was taken in Rome, but you can find this anywhere. After structural steel was invented and the elevator was invented, whether you go to Italy or India or Israel, you can find this building, which is basically the small cage elevator, this one staircase that wrapped around it, light that came through. It was the organizing structure for, say 30 apartments. Most people use the stairs. If you go to Rome and you go to one of these buildings, people never use the elevator unless they are carrying something heavy, right? And you meet your neighbors in that stairwell, right? So it's communal. And it's a wonderful way to build density, and they're quite dense buildings. But of course, this too is illegal, right? It's illegal because of, the smoke question and fire question up the atrium, and then you need two means of egress. And when you need two means of egress, you need a hallway to connect them. And then that hallway is, of course, a loss factor. And so what do you end up with? You end up with anonymity, right? And so someone's going to tell me, well, that residential building has to hit 83 or 85% efficiency, or the developer's not going to make any money. And then you end up with the thud, the dull thud of the same exact apartment building being built around the world. Or, there's certainly, these are 6 suburbs in 6 continents around the world, and it's the same exact situation where we can't, I'm sure many of you travel, and you travel these days, and you can land and have no idea where the hell you are. So let me draw a parallel. Food, right? More and more, people are dropping things like corporate beer, and they're going to craft beer. More and more, people are avoiding things like generic processed food. And yet, we live in this time where we're using technology to build processed cities. So I think we have to start over. And we have to think about not just technology, but the things that make us human. We're bipeds. We need light and air. We're still subject to the forces of gravity, last I checked. We need shelter from inclement weather. And then combine that with information age factors, the fact that work is a blurring thing with home, that increasingly we're seeing tech companies go into horizontal spaces as opposed to the skyscrapers with center. So, the center core, 45-foot core to glass thing that I learned from people like my good friend Carl sitting here at SOM, that was all generated from the file cabinets in legal offices. File cabinets? Ask a millennial what a file cabinet is. And yet we still use that standard like it makes any sense at all. Or autonomous vehicles, not just autonomous individual vehicles, but smaller forms of mass transit. And so our office has been doing a lot of work with rethinking the basic kind of ingredients of how you build a city. That if you look at the street and the sidewalk and the building and the rear yard, that with AVs and with other forms of microtransit, you might be able to recombine all of that spaces and get people-centered courtyards again. And so that's super interesting to me. The idea that we could use 21st century technology to achieve pre-20th century results. That we could use technology to rediscover our humanity. That we could create streets. So if AVs really learn not to hit people, right, that they can commingle on a street that doesn't have curbs, because those curbs are mandated by DOT because of the human error involved in driving. That you could have places that are much more humane in scale. If you've been out to Fire Island and think about the wooden walkways that are out there, you know what I'm talking about. That we could have different ways of protecting ourselves from inclement weather. So we had public space that operated more year-round. Those are issues that are really interesting to me. That maybe using things like tall timber construction, we could start to think about more humane, more warm buildings again. So I'm not trying to be a Luddite. I'm just trying to say, how do we use technology to find what we lost in the 20th century? And even there, we have to be careful, because I have a lot of friends who are city bikers, and you know, it's a great movement. At the same time, it's a slightly scary one-size-fits-all movement. I was born in Calcutta. I don't want it to look like Copenhagen. And so, you know, we have to be careful with this idea of making walkable, bikeable places, because what we're finding is places across the country that are more walkable and bikeable are less affordable. And that's because once people start living there, they start understanding how attractive those places are, and the prices go up. So a lot of what we're trying to do is think about the territory of the city a little bit differently. If after World War II, we built the Don Draper city, the city where everyone commuted into one kind of downtown, you see that breaking down into a more multinodal city. And I think with technology, this is only going to change further, that where work happens will be in a larger, broader part of our cities, which means that work can happen towards places that are more affordable to live in. And so within each of those nodes, I think the objective is, how can people meet most of their daily needs in a 20-minute walk? And so that has an impact on the architecture as well, that in those nodes, these buildings need to be porous. They need to speak to the communities around them. Jean Nouvel, the French architect, talks about the solidity of glass, that we think of glass as a transparent material, and in some cases it is, but oftentimes it's quite actually off-putting. And so we need to think about how our buildings connect to the world around them, because, yeah, we should grow transit-oriented cities. That's still the right idea. But it also has to have this feeling, you know, my dad was born in a very rural village in North India. And it's incredible how many of the sort of Jane Jacobs components that village has. And we have to think about sort of village life again, which is different than the suburbs, because a village is mixed use. And so each of these nodes can be a village. And we have these places. In fact, some of them are called the village. And you know, we have these places that are mixed use. And so this is another regulatory thing that city planning is working on. And I'm starting to use this word comdustrial, which is the idea of an office building, but not these like 80s office buildings we're building right now, but office buildings that actually can house light manufacturing, can house incubation space, have more infrastructure, have an operable window. Right, and have some of the feeling of our old warehouse buildings that are now going through the roof in terms of their pricing, but also offer 21st century technology. So one of the places where I've been working on the Domino site for years, and our challenge right now is to put a 400,000 square foot creative office building into the sugar refinery itself. It's a landmark, and so you can't open up the windows to get light in. And so, like, the first sketch was, how do you nest a new building in the old building? And so that's precisely what we're doing. And Jed is out there doing demo, and we're building this thing, and it'll be open, I think, in 21. It met with full landmarks approval. It met with full community board approval. And the idea of the glass barrel vault was to echo, since you're a room of builders, the reason these old industrial buildings had brick arched windows, anyone know why? because the older industrial buildings had a wooden lintel to hold up the brick above them. And so when there was a fire in the building, the lintels would catch fire and the entire building would collapse, which is exactly what happened at the Domino site in the previous refinery. So that's called the American round arch style, what that industrial building is made out of. And so it's really an homage to that style, that big singular arch up there, curved glass. A lot of interesting sustainability questions that we've had to solve with that. But also the porosity of the building on the ground floor, opening up all the windows to doors, inviting the public in, making the building something that, if you've been out to Domino Park, there's this beautiful 6.5-acre park out there. But what happens if there's a sudden rainstorm? We want to invite the community into this kind of nerve center of a building. So what's really critical about that is why do people, the two projects that people ask me about the most are the Highline and Domino, and I think the reason is that you can't be anywhere. Those two projects are grounded in the places and in the neighborhoods that they're in. And that matters to people as cities grow. So I think what communities are saying is we'll make you a grand bargain. We'll allow you to grow. But give us buildings, give us a place that resonates with our history and our culture, not something that can just be anywhere. This is in East New York, a project for an extraordinary man, a pastor, who owns this 11-acre site in what is still one of the poorest parts of New York City. This is 100% affordable housing. It's everything from transitional housing for the homeless to workforce housing, as well as this cultural heart, which constitutes the church, a performing arts center, which is the building you see on the left there, and a school, organized around a site plan of community streets with some of those same principles from Copenhagen, just without the Copenhagen part. And this is another big challenge. We talk about our cities like New York and San Francisco, but actually I think a lot of the big urbanization challenges in this country are outside of the center cities. We've been looking a lot at what you can do with 4+1 construction. This is Bentonville, Arkansas, where we won this competition. We achieved 45 units an acre of housing. And the whole trick was, what do you do with the parking? You still have to deal with parking in these places. So what's interesting is, you remember the Rome staircase example? IBZ allows you to build a 3.5-story building with one central staircase with apartments pinwheeling around it, as long as the ground floor units are ADA, and as long as the openings are built big enough in the apartments that you can escape. So that means that you can build one central open stair, right? Which dramatically lowers building costs. And so the whole idea was to then house the parking in a courtyard, and you see how the 3.5-story structure works. This is really important because it's not just about affordable tax credit housing, it's about bringing down the cost of construction in these places to build housing that's dense enough that workforce can afford it. So just give you a sense of that. And then I'm gonna just close with Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. Who knew how many lessons we could learn from the Mongolians? This is a fascinating place. I have a team there right now. We have 2 projects there. This is the coldest capital in the world. It's quite polluted. Those aren't nuclear plants. They're actually coal-fired power plants. Very, very proud culture, including the history of Genghis Khan, the famous leather armor. If you want a great book, it's called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, which will tell you that he allowed his troops to wear leather armor only on the front, because if they needed armor in the back, it meant they were running away, and then they shouldn't have armor. And so there's this really beautiful, this was actually the end of chainmail in Europe, because these folks could ride so much faster than European knights with metal all over them. And so the armor is a really important part of the country. So you can use glass. This is a glass tower that we're developing there that's a double skin, but has this form that's resonant. And it's really, one of my proudest moments was we presented this to some public officials and they said, it looks like our armor. Like they got it. Or a 12-acre site that's near that other site in the heart of the capital, where a shopping mall had been proposed. And this is music to an architect's ears. Our client who's the National Amusement Park of Mongolia, believe it or not. The chairman said to us, you know, Mongolians don't like shopping malls. They fail here because we are nomads at heart, and we do not like being controlled by space. So I wrote him a letter back that said, you know, there are urban nomadic traditions about being the flaneur, about being lost in a city. And so instead of, this is how you get killed on your own fees, instead of designing one building, we designed 41 and created a sort of village. And this is about to be constructed. And the colors come from all local construction techniques. This is concrete frame, brick infill, colorful stucco. In some cases, some of the more sort of foreground buildings like the folk theater will be copper. There's some local stones, but everything's local. Everything's going to be built by local craftspeople. And yes, there is a haunted house. So just my final slide to say, you know, look, I'm not saying our practice has all the answers, but one of the reasons this project is attracting attention, and especially in the context of a growing East Asia, is it's grounded in the culture. It's grounded in what people build. It's grounded in the climate. We're actually working with Bureau Happold on sustainability. That pavilion is actually being designed by Jamie Carpenter. There's these campfire moments where we're capturing heat, because if you go from -30 to -25, you've done something in Mongolia. So, you know, again, I don't want to be Debbie Downer. You know, I think we do have to work at this, though. This entire industry has to work at doing a better job of making buildings that resonate with people. And if we don't, then smarter and bolder or faster won't mean a thing. Thank you.
I'm switching up the program. Vishaan has agreed to take a question or two, and I can tell that people were very fascinated, including myself, by this. So 1, 2, 3 questions coming up. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Now there'll be no questions, watch.
And by the way, if I didn't ask for questions, I would have gotten it.
Anyone? Sir?
No. Based on your work, have you been able to influence policy so that some of these changes that you're talking about are starting to take effect in a broader sense?
Only in places, I mean, the last, and I think many of you were involved in this, you know, in the last go around in terms of the code, things like if you have a double skin wall, right, trying to get the building area in that double skin to not count as FAR, for example, but, you know, I think we did a kind of halfway job in getting there. I think there are places in the code, but, you know, I do think that glass building thing that the mayor launched, I mean, this is an alarm bell. It is a red flag. And it's not just about sustainability. You know, Tom mentioned that myself and Amanda Burden, Dan Doctoroff helped to plan Hudson Yards, and I think Hudson Yards is going to be a tremendous financial success for the city. But I don't think I have to tell this crowd that there's been a lot of architectural criticism of Hudson Yards. And I think it is in part because zoning, the codes that set up what could happen at Hudson Yards, to your question, is an incredibly blunt instrument. And doesn't, and I think for good reason, doesn't dictate things like aesthetics. And cities that have tried to dictate aesthetics through code, I think have done a fairly miserable job, and it becomes incredibly subjective, and I think it's problematic. But to me, the larger issue isn't code. The larger issue is the toolkit. If builders especially continue to walk into rooms with architects and their clients and say, well, for that budget, the only thing you can build is a flat window wall with 2 inches of metal trim on it. You know, yeah, like I said, we can try to all get away with that for as long as we can, but the music's gonna stop. When I was a baby architect, glass was the expensive material, right? I remember looking through the CDs for the curtain wall of Lever House. It's just the ubiquity of it
is something that we really need to deal with. And obviously, we need light and air and views. I'm not saying that we don't need all of those things. I'm not saying we shouldn't have built those buildings without windows. But I don't think this is a code issue. I think it's a lack of creativity. It's a lack of wanting to take risk. If there are attorneys in the room, you're not helping. But everyone has to deal with this problem. And I think you have to deal with it proactively, right? Before the regulations do something stupid. Because I'll tell you from my time in government, what happens is regulations tend to over-regulate and do stupid things when the market is behaving irresponsibly. Yes?
You offer an important challenge to the industry, but when you've been doing things through a certain lens for a long time, what suggestions do you have for the industry as a first step to start to broaden the lens towards to address the challenge you mentioned?
Sure. So I think the question was, what are some of the first steps you can do to address these challenges? Is that a fair? You can come to a conference where they invite someone who speaks about something totally off topic. Right? I think the first step is introspection. I think you have to look, go back to your office, look at the work on the wall, look at the work on the computers, and this country is an extraordinary place. We have just such levels of innovation. And so I think it's really hard for people to say that in one of the most innovative countries in the world, right, not just wealthy, there's a lot of wealthy countries in the world, but a lot of those wealthy countries don't invent things like a Tesla Model 3, which is a really awesome car, by the way. So we have the capacity to do this, but we're not, right? We're simply not doing it. And I think that requires introspection, and it requires developers, builders, architects, engineers, lawyers, all of us to work together to figure out what is the broader toolkit we have, and I'm not just talking about facades, to build buildings. Like that little 3.5-story building I showed in Arkansas, that's just reading the code and finding a kind of way to get creative with the code. So I just think it's like about starting with looking in the mirror. Tom?
All right, I'm going to throw out the Building Congress question. So the reason we're holding this is because the Building Congress is really uniquely qualified, I believe, to have the conversation because we cover everything, right? We're owners, labor,
Yep.
architects, contractors, everybody else. So if you had the power, let's say you were mayor, what would you ask the Building Congress?
In this shirt, it's never going to happen.
What would you say to the Building Congress? You've been inside of government, you've been outside of government. How do I hear you saying take a step back, but we have and under Carlo's leadership and others, we're getting our voice. What would you think the first steps would be to try to facilitate the kinds of things you're talking about?
Well, first of all, I think we're living in a very politically charged moment. That's not rocket science to figure out. And when a Philadelphia council member says, I'm going to ban bay windows, or the mayor starts talking about banning glass buildings, I think we need to start talking to our local elected officials in a more, like the next time you're at a fundraiser, right, actually talk to them about these issues. Because what I'm convinced about is these proposals are Trojan horses for the real issues, right? And start really understanding what they're hearing on the ground from their constituents. Because I'll tell you, we do a lot of work in the public. We're out in community boards a lot. People are angry at this industry. They are angry, and they shouldn't be. This industry has some of the greatest minds I've ever worked with in it. But they don't see us as addressing their needs and problems, and they don't see us building things that resonate with them. And so I think one of the first things to do is you guys organize a lot of forums and things as a building congress. Start inviting some of these local politicians here, and don't just mock them when they say something that you think is stupid. I'm not saying you'd ever do that, Tom, but I'm just saying we got to learn to listen to each other more in this country. beyond 140 characters and 280 characters. We have to learn to listen to each other more. And that starts with, these people are hearing things on the ground from their constituents. And, you know, that Amazon fight just blew my mind in terms of how much misrepresentation of facts there were, because no one was listening to each other. And I just think that's just a place to begin. And I think, again, we ignore this stuff at our peril. Right? Because, you know, I was talking to Carlo before the session about the fact that we're still building. I mean, it's really important to understand this industry in New York City is living off of largely the 100 rezonings that we did as part of the Bloomberg administration. Those rezonings have stopped. Right? The growth in zoning envelope in this city is slowing down rapidly. So what you're experiencing right now in the industry in this city is largely the consequence of planning and zoning that was done over a decade ago. Right? Hudson Yards, West Chelsea, Manhattanville, you just go just down the list. They were all rezonings passed between 2002 and 2008, and a lot of what we did was off the draft of 9/11 and a city that felt in crisis about building. That's not happening right now. All you have to do is look on the city planning website and see how many big upzonings are passing. They're not, right? So there will be a big slowdown, and this will hit everyone's pocketbook, right? Until we can convince the city that growth is a good thing and they're gonna get things that they want in their communities. And I think that's about conversation. All right, thank you.
You're a good man.
Thanks.